Today, we're having a really interesting guest with us. We're talking about two homes, two fathers, and one powerful story of resilience. And with me today is retired Judge Anthony Mohr. What happens when a kid is caught in the middle of a divorce and grows up to be a judge? Today, we're hearing from retired Judge Anthony Mohr, a child of divorce who lived two very different lives with two very different dads. And his story isn't just compelling, it's a mirror into the long-term impact divorce can have on a child's heart, mind, and identity. And the reason I wanted to bring this episode to you today is because as parents, we have so much fear about how the challenges and complexities of divorce and living under two roofs is going to have on our children. And we tend to what if the worst case scenarios. And today is a story that actually has a really nice ending. And Anthony wrote a memoir, which he's going to be talking about during our episode every other weekend, which tells his story. And so, welcome, Anthony.
Karen, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure. And yeah, you've pretty well summarized what I went through and what the book is all about. My folks divorced when I was 9 years old. It was not a rock'em sock'em nasty kind of a divorce, but they sure did have their differences. They were good enough to hide most of the problems from me. So when I researched the book, I actually had to go back through records and court records to find out a lot about what was really going on behind the curtain. The good news is both parents remarried. My stepfather was a good guy. He was very different from my father. My dad was an actor. He had been very well known in radio for playing Philip Marlowe, along with probably a couple of hundred other roles in radio theaters. And then he got into television, and he never had a series, but he had lots of feature appearances on Westerns and a couple of B movies, including one or two one with Kirk Douglas. Another, oh gosh, who was it? Omar Sharif in Funny Girl. That was his last movie.
So that in and of itself that little piece had to be fascinating, having a dad who was an actor in
it
Hollywood.
was. It gave me not a ringside seat on all of Hollywood, but certainly a close-up view of what was going on, especially with the quote-unquote B-list actors. The other stepfather was a businessman and an inventor. He held a lot of patents. He would start certain companies. His best known was Dashew Business Machines. His name was Stanley Dashew, which was ultimately sold to Hughes. And it gained fame because it made the machines that embossed and imprinted the Bank America card, which became Visa. That's what it is
My
today,
goodness,
the Visa card.
That's big.
Yeah. So they were two very opposite people with very opposite personalities. And basically as far across the spectrum as you could find them, because my dad was this very captivating guy with a beautiful baritone voice, and he was catnip to women. Stan had a trace of a New York accent. He didn't speak that well. Very bright, obviously, had to be as successful as he was. He was the Republican in the party, a solid Republican who would help Gerald Ford get his start because he lived in Grand Rapids then, and then was very connected with Richard Nixon, was actually asked into the administration to be a deputy secretary of transportation, but he turned it down. Meanwhile, my father was the Stevenson Kennedy Democrat who actually stumped California for Bobby Kennedy and was at the ambassador when Bobby was killed. So they were rather opposite people.
Yeah, so you're pouring this great foundation for us where you have this successful conservative businessman stepdad and this really cool catnip for women, love that phrase, liberal, both connected politically in different ways. And so just for you, 9 years old, how old were you when your mom remarried and Stan joined?
11.
Okay,
They
so
both remarried when I was 11, and they remarried within about 4 months of each other.
wow. And were they living close enough so that you were back and forth? You
Yes.
were.
Well, my mom moved to New York about a year after the separation because her family was back there. But we didn't stay in New York long. We were only there from February till December of 58 because When my mom met Stan in New York, it turned out Stan lived back in LA. So we moved back to California, and they never lived, my dad and Stan never lived more than maybe 5 miles apart, 6 miles apart at most.
So many parents are so worried about what this is going to do to their children, to have two roofs, to have four parents, to go back and forth. Can you just share, and your date just aged you, so people know you're talking about 58. So share what it was like for you. And you're entering puberty, and 11, 12, 13 are hard ages in different ways. How was that for you, going back and forth and dealing with such differing personalities?
Well, the divorce itself obviously was very traumatic. I still have lingering PTSD over it. The remarriages, I wanted my mother to remarry very badly. And she could have married Godzilla and I would have been happy because I knew how unhappy and miserable she was. And whether my father was going to get remarried, I never thought about it. It turned out he married the woman whom he met while he was married to my mom, and she took him away. She was from Sweden. They were in Sweden filming a series. One thing led to another. So after that, I'm rotating and shuttlecocking back and forth between two households. And there were times that I would compare back and forth. And very often I'd be over at my father's, and his second wife and I were really, we didn't get along that well. She could be very nasty. She started a lot of fights with him. He wanted to leave her. He ended up having an affair with a woman named Miriam, and the affair went until he died. It's a chapter in the book. I talk about it because he dragged me into the affair to try to, because I was sort of the foil that got him out of the house. And so I met her many, many times. And my grandmother couldn't stand the second wife. So she would vacate her apartment and let my dad and Miriam have their time in her apartment.
Okay, I can tell, guys, this is a very colorful book. I can tell that right away. Okay, keep
Here it
going.
is one more time. Yes, sirree, every other weekend. The little
So,
seal is an award it got. I'll crow it. It got a number of awards, which I'm proud of.
yeah,
Anyway,
that's like crazy. So, grandma was part of dad cheating on wife number two.
she was definitely happy about it. Very happy about it.
So
I mean,
here you are, and just to keep you on track, here you are, really, you're preteen, you're going to dad's, you
right,
love dad, dad's wife is not so lovely.
right.
And just in comparison, how is Stan in comparison to the stepmother?
Oh, worlds better. Now, Stan, on the other hand, was in many ways, he was not like my father. My dad lived life large. He and his guys would go to the Brown Derby and have laughs into the wee hours. Stan was conservative. He never cheated on my mother, always came home late because he worked late, but he was there. Now, he was the disciplinarian, which my father was not. Stan was, and he said, kids have got to work. And one time he actually embarrassed me in front of a lot of friends. A bunch of us were sitting in somebody's living room in Beverly Hills, which is where we settled once my mom remarried. And we were talking about a bunch of us taking a trip together. And so the parents and my friends were there, and so was my mom and Stan. And Stan starts lecturing everybody about how kids have to work. They shouldn't have so much fun. And one of my friends, Bobby, who was a brilliant, brilliant guy, he ended up becoming a dean at Yale Law School. But Bobby said, and I'll never forget this, he said, quote unquote, look, we are products of our affluence, end quote. And this was a complete opposite from my father. My father may have been very well known. You walk into a restaurant, people would want his autograph. We'd get the best table in the house, reservations or no reservation. But he was very hard up for money. Stan, on the other hand, was very wealthy. In fact, there's a book called You Only Have to Get Rich Once, and he's mentioned in it prominently. And Stan was unknown. He'd walk into a restaurant, wait, the hostess would ask, how do you spell your name, Dashu? Have a seat, we'll get back to you. And 30, 45 minutes later, they had a table for us. And so it was so opposite. That's really what struck me. The very famous man is hard up for money. The relative unknown outside the business world, a segment of the business world, is as wealthy as you can be.
Yeah. What an interesting contrast.
Yeah.
And then you had you being involved in dad's affair. And on the other hand, you had Stan being
Yeah.
so conservative and rigid. So as the story unfolds, what are some of the key memories that you have about that back and forth?
The fights between my father and they became more and more frequent as the years went on. Many times if I'm sitting there, I would think, boy, I'd rather be with my mother and Stan. It's no fun being over here.
Yeah.
Even though my dad and I had lots of fun together. We go out and do things alone, usually play miniature golf, sometimes go horseback riding, sometimes visit the studio if he had to drop by, and many times dropping by the unemployment agency so he could pick up a check.
And did you have a real sense of that, like the disparity of
Yes,
economics between like, did you feel it as you went from household to household?
I
Because it sounds
felt it.
like dad was pretty joyful.
I felt like my dad was joyful. He put on a good face, but I was aware of the economics because his second wife, wouldn't let us forget it. She would sit there and talk about how this is one time my father said, "Oh, we're having filet mignon tonight." And she said, "Do you know how much this costs? $1.50 each." That's in the book. Another time we were going to go see a movie that my father had starred in called The Angry Red Planet. That's kind of now a cult movie about a trip to Mars. And we were sitting around the breakfast table, and my two kids, Tommy and Timmy, whom I'm still in touch with, we're still friends. We were all talking, and she made some remark about how, well, I hope it makes some money. We need it. She
So
was
all of the inappropriate things that a parent shouldn't be doing in front of their kids, Maya is a good example of what not to do and not to be.
right. Meanwhile, Stan and my mom never crowed about how much money they had. They never told me how much money they had. I just knew they did because we lived in a house in Beverly Hills, which they owned. Stan built a 58-foot catamaran, the largest on the West Coast at that time. And we'd go sailing most weekends I was with them. We'd go to Catalina, sometimes to Santa Cruz Island. So I knew he had to have resources to do that.
Right.
And my mother let it slip once. This is not in the book, but she one time said to me, "Well, we're just small time millionaires." And that was in the early 60s. And to be a millionaire in the early 60s was to
It's
be,
pretty wealthy.
hundreds of millions today. So when she
Right.
said, "Oh, we're just small time millionaires," I felt very good and actually very secure.
Right. Right. So when you look back at your childhood and what you wrote in your book, how do I want to ask this? Can you describe for our listeners what some of the silver linings were? Because people always think it's just bad.
Well,
And
the
yet you
silver,
became a judge, so it wasn't all bad. So,
right.
what would you say in terms of your resilience or what you learned, or what were the positives that came out of this for you?
The silver lining positives were I became a judge. And it's not that I wanted to be a judge back then. I had no thoughts about where judges come from or anything else. But looking back, what it taught me was navigating two cultures.
Mm.
Okay. This was like living in Japan one weekend and living in Nigeria the other weekend, something like that. Or to bring it closer to home, living in New York City one weekend and living in Hot Springs, Arkansas the next weekend. It's totally different cultures.
Right.
And you have to learn to adapt to them. And it's not like I sat down one night and said, "Okay, Mohr, you're going to have to figure out how to get along with one and then get along with the other." It just sort of happened. It arose organically. And I would do my best, often with lots of mistakes and goofs and missteps. But looking back, I realized, okay, if I'm dealing with this and more or less enduring, this kind of is good preparation for being on the bench because you're listening to different points of view, different stories, and you're trying to figure out what makes these people tick. Why are they not getting along? What can
Right.
you do to solve the problem or simply make the decision based on the law? And without the exposure to two different households, it would have been more difficult. So I would say to anybody who is going through every other weekend in terms of different households, if you don't want to become a scientist, become a judge.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a quick sponsor break. And when we get back, I want to talk more about these personality traits, skills, perspectives that emerged from being in two different households. So let's jump back in. I love the connection between the difference of your households and then being a judge and having that um, lived experience so that you had a much, it sounds like your perspective with the people who came before you was more expansive because of your lived experience.
I think it would be for anybody who has two different households in their childhood, they're going to have that wider perspective. I just think it's going to come with the territory.
And can you put words to that a little bit more as to, can you describe kind of your secret sauce in that area? So I'm hearing what life was like as a child, but then you're emerging with different perspectives, different skill sets, different ways of looking at things. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And if you talk about it in your book, feel free to reference
Well,
that.
I just opened to the table of contents, which will help, I hope. There are two parts, if you will. The part one is with my father only, where I raise the action until we get to the divorce.
Right,
And
right.
then part two is every other weekend. And the first chapter is radio in the light, because initially as a child, I was listening to my father on the radio, and radio back then was radio plays, and it was somber. It wasn't that happy. The music was usually off from an organ,
Yep.
and a lot of those plays were difficult, if you were, people down on their luck. So
Yes.
I never really cared for the radio. But now we move into the new marriage, and Stan had two children, one of whom, Skip, was 5 years older than I, the brother I always wanted. And he
Right.
loved top 40 radio. And he introduced me to it. So the chapter is titled Radio in the Light. And it was great coming home and listening to the swinging gentlemen, as they called them on KFWB, Bill Ballance, Bob Eubanks, B. Mitchell Reed, Gene Weed, all these people. These are middle-aged guys acting like kids. They were almost like playmates on the air, which was
Right.
wonderful. Then the next chapter is called Strictly Business. And that's with Stan going down to his plant, watching how he's doing things and quote unquote bossing people around. He's and Stan wasn't the conversationalist my father was. My dad was a polymath. We talked about everything constantly, the supernatural, Shakespeare, politics, sports, especially the Dodgers. Stan talked about business and he talked about sailing. He loved to sail. He had cruised for a year and a half back in 1949. He was very much all business. And so I'm watching this, and the company went public. So I saw the procedure from a long distance, an 11-year-old kid. But I watched them go public and watched all the businessmen showing up for dinner. And they all are wearing white shirts and ties and suits. And if they laughed, it was a kind of a guffaw like that, and contest.
And dad's friends were dressed a little different, I imagine.
Oh, they were actors. They were actors, and they were expansive, and they would sometimes play roles in the living room and jump around. It was rilery all the way.
So, Anthony, tell me, fast forward as you started getting your adult feet under you.
Yeah.
And this may or may not be referenced in your book, but I'm so curious. Like, we all know a little bit about what we get from our mom and what we get from our dad. So, what I would love for you to describe is how your personality developed as a young adult because of your exposure to these incredibly different men. Like, how would you describe what you got from each of them in terms of who you became?
Probably from Stan, more of a work ethic. When I was a lawyer, I worked long hours. When I was a judge, I actually worked long hours. Either I'm on the bench all day, and then if it's a civil case, you're reading briefs, for another 2 or 3 hours, sometimes four when I sat in what we call complex litigation. I had that, I think I got that work ethic from Stan. My father, in many ways, he was a great actor and he worked very hard at his craft. But if he wasn't working, he'd sleep till noon.
Ah,
Mother always wanted him to write. He was a great writer, but he never tried. He never worked on the craft. He never thought about directing or anything like that. He was kind of lazy in that respect. On the other hand, I got a theatrical bent out of my father. Actually, for 2 years before I became a judge, I belonged to an improv theater company.
Oh,
The-
wow.
Yeah, the LA Connection, because I always loved improv, which I always picked up from my dad. And I did impromptu speaking in high school and did well with it. And I loved it. It was
Were you
great. To,
were you a trial judge, trial
yes,
attorney?
yes, I was.
So
But
did any of your dad's theatrics show up in your when you were on trial?
not enough. If I had been a district attorney, a deputy DA or an assistant U.S. attorney, more would have shown up because you're in court more. As a civil business litigator, you really don't try that many cases.
Okay.
But there were times I would be theatrical in a deposition sometimes, playing a game or whatever in court, doing whatever. I had one deposition. I shouldn't be proud of this, but I am. I had a very hot tempered person, and I kept mispronouncing her name on purpose because the first time I did, she got really angry at me. And
And you
so I
thought,
just kept
oh,
missing her name every single time. And I just got her angrier and angrier, which is something my dad would have done just for the fun of it. Stan wouldn't have done that.
right, right.
So, I had that sort of wacky off center attitude from my father.
Beautiful.
But I'll also tell you this. And that is, it was difficult.
Yeah.
In many ways, it was very difficult. There were times I would just sit there and go, what's going on here? I was never teased about it. I was never excluded in school because of it. My friends were all from very solid, intact families, but I
And
never,
if I heard you correctly, you had step siblings in both houses.
right. And we're all very
That's
close still.
interesting. So you're the one shuttling back and forth, but everyone else is staying still.
That's correct.
Mm.
That's correct. And they never met each other. I don't think my dad and my ever met. And none of, with one exception, my high school friends never met my father. They always knew Stan, and they were at my house very often. And Stan was very friendly, and they loved him, and he liked them. But
Not so much. Was it because of the evil stepmother that you didn't bring your friends
no,
with you down?
it just never happened because I was over there only on alternate weekends and just for the couple of days. And I never brought my friends over there.
Hmm.
And if we were going to go to a party or if I had a date, it was at my mother's house, mom and Stan.
Yeah.
And if I had a party, it was at that house, not at my father's.
Yeah.
And I never thought about it going the other way. I never thought, gee, I ought to have a party at my father's house. That never crossed my mind until this moment as we speak.
Yeah, because dad's all fun and theatrical, and I
Yeah,
would think that he'd be quite the hip dad to have your
I
friend.
never thought about it. I
That's
never thought about it. And it might have been it. Now, as I'm sitting here imagining it through, I keep thinking, well, mine wouldn't have been the greatest to be around. And,
exactly.
money is tight. So what kind of refreshments are there going to be?
Good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What made you write the memoir?
My parents were very friendly with the literary agent, who unfortunately passed away by the time I was ready to write the book. But she kept urging me to write my story, especially when I became a judge. She said, you've got a very interesting story. You should write about it. And I never was really ready to do it. I kept saying, oh, I have a boring life. There's nothing to tell. Come on, Doris, there's no real, what for? But I always enjoyed writing a little bit, and I'd write little short stories or essays. And finally, I went to a writers' conference, and a couple of people there urged me to write something much longer. And the result is this book,
Yeah.
which I will show again for everybody who may want to read it.
Every other weekend,
Every
coming
other
of age
weekend
with
by
two
Kohler
different
Books. There
dads.
you are.
Anthony Mohr, and that'll be in the show notes for you guys if you want to grab a copy and read it. As we begin to wrap up, what are you clearly were successful after all of this. You're sharing that it was had both its benefits, but it was also hard. And it was also the late 1950s. My parents got divorced in the early 70s, and it still there weren't a lot of people divorcing. So back in the late 50s.
Oh, it was, to use a Yiddish term, it was a shanda.
Yeah,
It
what
was a
did you have,
disgrace.
yeah, you had like a scarlet letter on you or something. And so that sounds like that piece could be isolating. having siblings, step siblings, and being the only one shuttling back and forth sounds like that had its own little piece to it.
It's
And
like
yet,
belonging to two different gangs.
yeah, yeah. And so you're saying that it really helped once you became a judge. Are there any other final things that you want to share in terms of either where you struggled and it could have been different if your parents knew better, or where else it benefited you having such an eclectic and unusual childhood?
If my parents knew better, they would have sent me into therapy.
Okay, good. That's a good thing to say.
Yeah. That's the advice I've always been asked to give people. Do you have any advice to parents if they're getting divorced, they have children? I say, get the kid into therapy.
Yeah,
He
because
may
there's
still be the
so
happiest kid in the world. Get him into therapy.
and just to stay on that point for a second, there's such a loyalty struggle. It's like, how do I talk to mom about dad and I'm being disloyal to like it's almost like there's nobody to talk to. And as a kid, that could feel so isolating. And then you go into a therapist office where, at least in today's day and age, unless you're trying to harm yourself or others, it's totally confidential. So you have this really
Right.
safe container where you can just unload whatever it is that's going on in your head and heart.
That's true. As I said, I was pretty lucky because I never felt isolated or teased or excluded because of the divorce. My friends never treated me differently.
Right.
Teachers never treated me differently. So I was lucky in that way.
Was it weird to come home to like mom and Stan when they had just done something for a weekend that you weren't a part of? Was there anything in that piece of it because your step siblings were engaging in activities when you weren't around on both sides?
To come home to mom and Stan, no, because they were always sailing or they had gone to Catalina for the weekend. And I always got seasick. So I wasn't that happy on the boat. It was very nice not to be on the boat.
So that was a plus for you.
That was a plus.
That's
On the
fascinating.
other hand, Tommy and Timmy were getting exposed to Hollywood. They would sometimes be asked to stand in a show that's being filmed.
Oh,
And that made me a little jealous.
yeah.
And I remember at one point there was every Christmas, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce puts on a Christmas parade. And one time they told me they had been in the parade. And I went to my father and I said, Tommy and Timmy were in the Christmas parade. And he goes, yeah. I said, well, I'd like to be in it too. And the next couple of years, he had me in it.
So he's a good dad. He heard you, he took care of you,
Yes.
and beautiful,
Yeah. He
beautiful.
heard me, took care of me. We were all in the parade, went to the party. There was a huge parade party, actually at a car dealership that they cleared out and dressed up for the occasion. And so yeah, I loved it both times, both years. They were wonderful.
And when you got older and you got married, was everybody able to come together and celebrate in a
Everybody
way?
was dead.
Oh my, I'm so
I
sorry.
got married at 66.
Oh my goodness. Well, kudos to you.
My mother had died. My father had died young, actually. The stepmother had died. Stan was still around. He lived to 96. So Stan was still around. But I take that back. I take that back. He died about a month before Bev and I got married.
Gotcha. So you got married late.
Very late. That I'm sure that's traceable to the divorce.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sure it is because I really had no desire to get married. Just
yeah.
none. I looked at marriage as a kind of a trap, a danger zone. I had seen one bad marriage, my mother and father, it was not obvious in front of me, but obviously underneath it was. And I drew cartoons, and the cartoon characters who were adults often spoke to each other with fire coming out of their nostrils or mouths. So something was going on. And then my father's second marriage was poison. And my mother and Stan had a storybook marriage. Theirs was wonderful, but it didn't offset the effects of the other two marriages.
Yeah. So just as we wrap up, do you have a different opinion of marriage now that you're in one?
Yeah, it's good being married. Got to find the right person, but it's good being married.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to tell us about your memoir before we say goodbye?
It's available everywhere.
Mm.
Okay. Get it on Amazon, get it on Barnes and Noble, the thrift books, indie bound, all over the place.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting, creative. Will give our listeners a peek, more of a peek into your experience as a kid of two divorced parents and then blended families. So you have both of it. What's that? I can't, something happened. All of a sudden, I'm not hearing you. Oh, that's so strange. We're going to wrap up.
I'm sorry, I thought I lost you.
Nope.
Okay. Anyway, I'll say it one more time. Every other weekend, coming of age with two different dads.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your memoir. And yeah, congratulations on your late marriage and congratulations on your book and your book tour. And yeah, folks, check out the show notes. Grab yourself this really interesting book to read. And Anthony, thank you again.
Karen, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, right back at you. And we'll be back again real soon with another episode. You guys have a great day.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for joining us on the Journey Beyond Divorce podcast. I hope you found guidance and encouragement to help you along your journey. If you like my podcast, please take a minute to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. You can also visit us at jbddivorcesupport.com, where our team of coaches support both men and women through our one-on-one coaching, group programs, online courses, and free resources. Stay tuned for our next episode, and I'll talk to you soon.